Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum and host for today's conversation. The Denison Forum podcast exists to help explain the culture, the world to the church so that the church can be redemptive in the culture. Or as Jesus said, we want to be salt and light to the world, or as I like to say, to be salty bright, wherever we are, whatever we're involved in, whoever we're relating to. And we hope these conversations help you to do that they encourage and equip you to be those kind of salty, bright disciples in our generation. Today, we're excited about a conversation with one of the folks I have really enjoyed following the last 10 plus years. Dr. Russell Moore is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and is the author of the book, Courage to Stand. He is also author of the upcoming book, Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. We're going to talk about both of those works. The Wall Street Journal has called Russell Moore vigorous, cheerful, and fiercely articulate. He was named in 2017 to Political Magazine's top 50 influence makers in Washington and has been profiled by such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and the New Yorker. He is an ordained Baptist minister and served previously as president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and before that was chief academic officer and dean of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky. He also taught theology and ethics there. Moore was a fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics and currently serves on the board of the Becket Law and as a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C. He also hosts the weekly podcast, The Russell Moore Show, and is co-host of Christianity Today's weekly news and analyst podcast, The Bulletin. He is a native of Mississippi, and he and his wife, Maria, are the parents of 5 sons. They live in Nashville, where he teaches the Bible regularly at his congregation, Emmanuel Church. Welcome, Dr. Russell Moore, to the Denison Forum podcast. Dr. Russell Moore, welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. We're glad to have you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to ask you the elevator conversation, which is I stepped about a year and a half ago from being a pastor for 34 years into this new world. And the biggest struggle I've had is to figure out how do I explain what I do now to my wife in less than a minute and a half. So I'm just curious. You and I are both preachers, and I came up with the alliteration. I could say, well, Russell Moore is a preacher, a pastor, a professor, a pundit in the most positive sense, and a podcaster. But how would you explain that if you stepped on the elevator in Nashville or anywhere else and somebody said, so who are you and what do you do? How do you explain that?
Usually, if somebody just says, who are you and what do you do, I will say, I'm a writer or I'm a Baptist minister. It really depends on what the context is as to how much they actually want to know.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So if I can find some good handles on that, it would help me to get better. You and I have some mutual, I don't know if I would call friends, but heroes. The names of David French and Tim Keller, everybody in the evangelical world, at least maybe not everybody, but many. And I've heard you talk in recent days about your relationship with Pastor Keller. Just kind of wondering now, a few days, couple of weeks into the time when he passed, how's that working? And tell us a little bit about your relationship with him from our side, my side. One of the most significant voices in the Christian world, evangelical world over the last 30, 40 years. How are you processing that? What's kind of become more clear about your relationship with Tim Keller?
There are a lot of us who I think right now still can't believe he's actually gone. That comes up quite a bit in conversations with people. He was part of a book club that I'm a part of that we've been in for years and years. And I tell people it's not really a book club. The books are the excuse but it's more like a brotherhood breakfast for people who would understand that sort of old school Baptist lingo. It's a kind of a fellowship group, and well, it, it's he was somebody who went out of his way to encourage, to counsel, to build up, even in times when he was, for instance, going through chemotherapy and things like that. And so, usually we would talk about things going on in the church, about books a lot, about books that have come out. But when he gave counsel, I listened to it. He's the one who I was at a place in my ministry where I was thinking that I was about to leave that ministry, and he talked me into staying. And then later, I was at a place where I was again thinking about leaving, but I had just kind of been mulling it, and he talked me into leaving. So when he said something, you knew that he knew what he was talking about, and he was a genuine, godly, humble man, and quite an evangelist. Just by the nature of what we do, he and I would often be together in rooms with atheists and agnostics and everything else. And I could see the way that he would bear witness to Christ uh, in amazing ways. It was never marketing, manipulation. It was genuine New Testament bearing witness. And so we're not going to see the likes of Tim Keller again.
Well, and that's been one of my thoughts and concerns. As far as Tim Keller, I can remember the first time somebody put one of his resources, the very popular Prodigal God, in my hand,
Mhm.
and my wife and I were just taken by it from the first time that we got our hands on it. I suspect many pastors are quoting Tim Keller in sermons, especially right now.
Yeah.
But putting some of his resources, I was just wishing in these last days that I had connected to his ministry earlier.
Mhm.
And many people, he inspired many to want to consider being Presbyterian in some ways, I would
Right.
suspect.
Right.
And but you mentioned leaving, which part of that has to do with leaving the denomination of Southern Baptist, which is also a part of my story. I was raised Roman Catholic and then came to Christ as a teenager through the witness of a Southern Baptist teenager that was a friend of mine, and then later discipled by his church. I'm in Texas. I've always identified more as a Texas Baptist, perhaps more than a Southern Baptist. And people who care about such things know what I mean by that.
Mhm.
But it's been a big deal, an interesting journey for you in terms of association. Kind of where are you in that journey now as it relates to your connection to the larger evangelical world? How would you frame that?
My connection to the larger evangelical world
Or to
is
Southern Baptist or
to Southern Baptists. I mean, in terms of the Southern Baptist Convention, I mean, there are a lot of people who will say, well, when you left the SBC, you don't leave a convention. A
right.
convention really isn't anything. It's except a collection of churches. And so I am part of a church that's multi-denominational, still and always will consider myself to be a Baptist. That's what my ordination is. That's who I am. That's what my theology is. So I think of myself as a Baptist Southerner, and maybe a Southern Baptist with a small s. But yeah.
No, I totally get it. And for people who don't understand how Baptists operate, they just kind of shake their hands and walk away. And I sometimes do that myself. So.
Yeah, there's a couple of tells that I would always know if somebody, if a secular journalist, well, any kind of journalist, was asking about asking about Southern Baptist matters, I would know that they didn't know what they were talking about if they said the Southern Baptist Church. I would know, okay, well, you haven't done your homework here.
Right.
And then there were a couple of others. I mean, it's been a long time since this has been the case. But if somebody would, for instance, reference the Women's Missionary Union instead of Woman's Missionary Union, which, I mean, who knows why it was worded that way, but that's the way it's worded. So there are all these little particularities that it's hard for people on the outside to understand.
Right. And probably true of other groups as well. If we got inside of them, they'd all have their particular corporate language and inside stories, inside jokes, all of those things.
Acronyms, yeah.
Yes. Well, we want to talk about the important topic of courage today. And it's challenging to be a courageous believer in the world today. As I was preparing to have this conversation with you, I was reminded of a C.S. Lewis quote, another one of our heroes in the Screw Tape Letters. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. Your book, Courage to Stand, has been out a while now. Just wondered if you would tell us, what was it that prompted you to write a book about courage?
I think largely because the conversations that I was having with people and the conversations that I was having with myself, it tended toward a misunderstanding of some of the most courageous people that I knew didn't think of themselves as courageous because they felt scared. And some of the most cowardly people I knew believed themselves to be very courageous. And so it was a process of asking, how does that happen? What does courage actually look like biblically defined? And so I spent a lot of time with the life of Elijah in 1 Kings 18 and 19 and realized that the picture of Elijah just is not anything like the sort of fake bravado that we're accustomed to, not just in this culture, but in many other times, where the idea is if I pretend as though I'm invulnerable, that will make me invulnerable, and if I posture in such a way that whoever the crowd behind me is applauding because I hate the same people they do. That's courage, and that's just not. It's just not what courage is. So I looked at life of Elijah and elsewhere to try to figure out exactly how does God form courage, and how does somebody who is lacking courage find it. And so that it really, most of the things that I write start with having conversations with people and not really being satisfied with what I've said to them.
Hmm.
And I come away and say, I just don't think that I don't think I got through with that because I don't think I've thought about this enough. That was how I wrote the book Adopted for Life. It was because I would be trying to talk to people about adoption and foster care and realize I haven't really worked through what my own objections were and how biblically I answered them. And so I wrote that book to help me figure it out. And with Tempted and Tried, another book I did, it was because I was having a lot of people who thought that they were failing because they were constantly fighting against temptation when they're actually succeeding. You know, that's what the Spirit does.
Right.
And so I was trying to explain that better. So that's usually how things come about.
So was there something that made you lock on to Elijah as the focus of your study? There's obviously a lot of characters in the Bible that you could choose from, starting with Jesus on down,
right?
When it comes to courage, both positive and negative examples. And Elijah has some of both, as your book really describes in some very powerful and clear ways. But was there something that, as you worked your way, okay, I want to try to talk about this topic to help people to equip them, encourage them about what courage really looks like and how it can manifest itself in their life. As you were talking, I was thinking, okay, that might have been a conversation in the coffee shop when you're waiting to get your latte, and you're having a conversation, or you could have been in an academic setting. You could have been in a lot of different kinds of conversations. But the book, as I worked my way through it, was not, in my feeling, it wasn't targeted at the academic community per se,
Right.
as much as the guy in the coffee shop who
Yeah.
wants to be courageous, doesn't know if he is or if he will be when the moment comes, but he needs a clear definition of what it really looks like. But what was it about Elijah that really caused you to lock in on his example?
I think because I noticed that I had a skewed view of Elijah, even though I knew the biblical narrative and have since I was, a 3-year-old in Southern Baptist Sunday school. But I tended to think of Elijah first as the guy on Mount Carmel calling down fire from heaven. That moment of triumph. And then the moment later on when he's trekking out in the wilderness toward Mount Horeb, that was kind of a deviation from the plot. That was sort of that was sort of a pause in the plot and some tension before he comes back to his main purpose and identity. But I realize that's not what the text itself is showing us. It's showing us instead that that's where Elijah actually encountered God, was in that moment of great weakness and vulnerability in every possible way. And that's what I determined really was the problem. I mean, there are a lot of people who are, I mean, whether it is a mom who is saying, I don't know what's going to happen with my child, that I'm worried about, I don't know what to do, or whether it's the person who is saying, I'm in a workplace that I don't know if I should stay here, or a toxic church situation. I mean, there's so many different situations that this applies to, where people often think, I have to I have to make sure that I give the image and the picture of winning and victory in order to do that. And so I think about, there was Skip Bayless, the ESPN commentator, was once denigrating an NFL player who had acknowledged that he was being treated for depression, because he said, you're letting down the team. The team needs to see you as somebody that they can count on and that they can follow, which of course assumes that somebody who's acknowledging and actually dealing with his depression is somebody who's not doing those things.
Right.
But that's kind of a social Darwinian sort of mentality that we see all over the place, in not just in American culture, but in church culture. I mean, I talk to a lot of pastors. Every day I have this conversation with somebody who, pastors who are on the verge of quitting. They're in a place of despair and they have nobody to talk to, because if they were to say anything, as one pastor just said to me just a couple days ago, if I were to say to my staff, hey, I'm discouraged and I just don't know what to do right now, it would create a panic. Can't talk to them, can't talk to people in the church for the same reason. And he said, I can't talk to the other pastors in the community because he said, I know we shouldn't think of each other as competitors, but we kind of do.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is in this place of loneliness. And I think there are a lot of people who are going through that. And what I've sort of seen, at least in my own life, is that those moments where you're kind of in the in between and you don't actually know what to do and you don't know how things are going to turn out, that if you look back, those are actually the places where God is doing the most in your life. It's really not those moments of triumph that are there. And so a friend of mine, David Brooks, talks about in one of his books, he talked about the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. The
Yes.
resume virtues being the things that you accomplish and the kind of things that you would list off if you were looking for a job. Almost none of us, when we're saying, okay, where did I really encounter God and where was I really changed? Almost none of us would look to the things that we would highlight on our resumes. Instead, we look at those moments that are more likely to be highlighted at our eulogies. And in many cases, those are moments that don't feel like winning. They feel like defeat at the time. But there's power in that.
Yeah, and that's always been one of the conundrums for me as a believer. You hear people often say that, well, I met God, I encountered God mostly in a difficult moment when I was really afraid.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, but I don't want to live in those moments all the time.
Right. Yeah.
I would hope that there would be, at least selfishly, I'm kind of hoping that there's long stretches of peace and tranquility. I can remember,
Yeah.
I helped to found a church here in my community and stayed as pastor of that church for 24 years. I can remember being in a very hard season at that church, thinking that we were kind of like the Corinthians, where it says basically in 1 Corinthians 11, it would have just been better off if you'd all stayed at home. and I had a season, not just of a Sunday or two, but of several Sundays measured by months, where I was like, it would probably have been better if we just all stayed home,
Yeah.
particularly when it came to some of the leadership meetings that I was leading in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember landing on this verse in the book of Acts after Paul's conversion, where it says that then the church had peace. And the Lord added to the church. I thought, that's the verse I want to see fulfilled in my life. I want to be in a place of peace. It just seems like in our current culture, with all of the dynamics and something strange, new, scary coming around the corner almost every single day, that there are a lot of epidemics going on, not the least of which is an epidemic of fear, which is why this book is so helpful. What would you say to people listening to this in terms of, okay, here's where you know that fear is getting the best of you instead of your faith guiding you?
Yeah. Well, what I would say to that is it can do that in multiple different ways. And so you almost have to first be familiar with where your particular vulnerabilities are, because fear can manifest itself in some people as a kind of withdrawal. So because they're afraid, they're kind of locking down into a risk aversion. They're isolating themselves off from people. For others, it can be in a kind of despair, where you just, your expectations are all so low. You don't even expect things to get better at all. And for some people, it can manifest itself in what feels like anger. And that's why I say there are a lot of people who think they're courageous who are actually very cowardly, because the way that they respond to fear is with quarrelsomeness and with perpetual outrage and anger. And so it's almost those categories of fight or flight or freezing, those sorts of things, and it over time strips you down. And then I think for some people, there's a kind of fear that you don't even really recognize because it's so chronic and so generalized. So, I mean, we were talking about Tim Keller. One of the things that Tim said to me after I had been through a kind of a tumult, he said, "You really need to watch your anger." And I said, "I'm not angry. I don't have one bit of anger for anybody involved in this. I really don't." He said, "I know. And that's what worries me." He said, I'm afraid that you've got a current of anger that you're not even aware of. He said, probably because you don't think you can be aware of it. And that's really dangerous. You need to find it. And so it's something that will manifest itself in various different ways. So it's kind of like when you talk about Lewis, one of the things that Lewis said that I think about probably every day is when he says the devil doesn't send errors or vices into the world one by one, but two by two on either side of a virtue.
Mm.
So you have courage. You have one way you can deviate from that is a kind of pugilism and a fighting spirit, or what the Bible refers to as a constant craving for controversy.
Mm.
Or it can be experienced by a kind of timidity. And and it all ultimately leads to the same place, which is cynicism and numbness and deadness. But you almost have to know, okay, where is my particular weak point? Because a lot of times you'll have people where what they're wanting to talk to you about, you have to say, okay, wait, but that's not your problem.
Mm.
There are a lot of people who might say, I want to be more courageous. And what they mean is, I don't want to be timid, when they don't have a personality bent to be timid.
Right.
They have a personality bent to sort of absorb themselves into a crowd and scream at other crowds,
Mm.
And so
Right.
you have to identify that to know really how fear is working.
Well, it's such a good insight in Timothy Keller in that conversation. That we're taught so many things biblically, right? That we build up an understanding that sometimes needs to be better informed, which is, well, I'm not supposed to be angry with anybody, and if I am, I'm
Yeah.
supposed to repent of that, and I want to be able to honestly say, well, I'm not angry with anybody, and
Yeah.
but actually, there's times when we can be and even should be angry with a person and work our way through that. But we build up this facade that we think is what true Christianity and true faith looks like,
Yeah.
when in fact it doesn't have the honesty and the integrity that it should have.
And that's
Um,
especially true when you're dealing with uh, church situations. And
yes.
I really saw this, I think, in working on issues of trauma, and particularly church related trauma. I came across a psychologist who had been working in the area of children who've been abused by their parents, and about how sometimes there is this dogged loyalty of abused children to their abusive parents. And this person called it a betrayal bond, and said it's because that child, it is terrifying to think my parents might be abusive. There might be something wrong with them, because that gives you the sense of, am I going to be abandoned? So instead, the child finds a way to blame that upon himself or herself. If only I hadn't been as loud coming into the room, then that wouldn't happen. If only my grades were better, then daddy wouldn't drink as much as he does, or whatever that is. And they sort of turn the anger internally. And I've seen that happen in a lot of church situations, where you have people who would say, if I actually think about what's going on here, it's terrifying, because I've been taught to see my church or my church tradition and Jesus
Mm.
as being indistinguishable at the limbic level. They might be very distinguishable at the cognitive level. You know theologically the difference, but you don't know the difference at that deeper heart level, and so you submerge it. And I
Mm.
think that happens with a lot of people often.
Well, and it's natural how it can happen, right? Because
Yeah,
especially we build very deep emotional ties to our congregations, as we should.
yeah,
But if we're not careful to differentiate that, as people joined my church over the years, I would do a membership class and would try to tell them, church is a very good place to get hurt. It's a very good place, kind of like a marriage or any, all families are dysfunctional at some level. But you have to come to a place where you can differentiate between, okay, this is Jesus and this is church. I remember listening to your conversation with Beth Moore recently about her memoir, just the ability that God gave her to distinguish, okay, well, these are Christians and these are people in the process of being redeemed. They're not fully redeemed and they're not equal to Jesus, either on an individual or congregational level. It's so important to make that kind of distinction so that you're not disillusioned with the church, because you need the church. And that's one of the things. There's an entire chapter in your book called Courage and Community, Connectedness Through Loneliness. Unpack that a little bit, because each of these chapters is titled this way, kind of ironically intersecting things that seem to be opposites. How does that work out in Elijah? How does that work out for us? That we need this connectedness, but there's also a sense of loneliness that is necessary for us to understand it right. Do you believe a fifth great awakening is possible in America? At Denison Forum, we're asking God that we might play a role in His movement in our country. We believe that discerning news from a biblical perspective can help all Christians stand for God in our increasingly secular culture. If you likewise stand with our mission, please give today toward our summer campaign at dfpodcast.org. Plus, any gift today will be doubled by a generous matching grant of $75,000. Visit dfpodcast.org to partner with us today.
Well, it's like anything else. Anything can become an idol. And what an idol is something that you can simultaneously master and that masters you. And community can become that as well. So that I was having a conversation with an atheist friend who was talking to me about research that he had done in fragmentation in American life and polarization in American life. And he said that the metaphor that he kept coming back to was the Tower of Babel. That there's this people can't even understand each other. And I said, yeah, but the problem with the Tower of Babel wasn't the fragmentation. God did that. The problem was the wrong kind of unity. And so if you think about what God is doing in the Tower of Babel, is He's taking something that is unified, but in the wrong direction. And He's pulling it apart, fragmenting it, not just to have isolated pieces, but to build an actual unity and an actual community through the family of Abraham, ultimately then in Jesus Christ. And so there are times when community itself becomes an idol for us, where you think, okay, I have to figure out who my tribe is. And whoever my tribe is, that means that I have to do everything that it takes to be on the inside of that tribe. I need to love all the right things, hate all the right people, say all the right shibboleths. And what happens then is that kind of community actually prevents genuine community on down the road. So if you look at, for instance, what the Apostle Paul is going through in Galatia, it would have been really easy for Paul just to say, okay, it's in order to preserve the unity here in the Galatian church, I'm not really going to bring up the touchy subject of circumcision. I'm not going to deal with Simon Peter refusing to eat at the table with the Gentiles. I'll conserve my influence until later when I'll deal with that. What Paul knew is, he said, if we had yielded to them, we didn't yield to them for a moment. Why? so that the gospel would be preserved for you. So if you look back, for instance, over Jim Crow, and you look at, there were so many white pastors, some of them identified and called out by Martin Luther King in Letter from Birmingham Jail, who knew what the Bible taught about these issues, and they knew that the Jim Crow structure was unjust. But what did they do? They said, I don't want to disrupt the unity of this congregation by bringing up this issue, which means what? They end up without the ability to speak to the community of the next generation. A lot of other things. They have to stand for judgment seat of Christ, but they also lose the ability to speak to people who aren't there. So sometimes there's a kind of unity that feels like unity, but it really is appeasing whoever has the most power to hurt you. And sometimes in an organization, that can be the people who pay most of the bills. Sometimes it can be the people who, we're at a time right now where shamelessness is a superpower, as they say, meaning that if somebody can get beyond the limitations of shame that typically put a check on what it is that we will actually do, if somebody can get beyond that, they can do anything. And they know that there are people who will just step back and then ultimately say, well, this is the way it is. And after a while, that is the way it is. And you end up with an entire new generation that says, that's the way it's always been, because it's what they've witnessed. And so you have these patterns that then continue. So every time that you've got biblically genuine community emerging, it's because you have had somebody who is willing to go out seemingly alone. Elijah goes out, thinks he's all by himself. I'm the only one here. And what does God say? No, there are 7,000 that have not kissed Baal. And there's a great multitude that's coming out of that. People you don't even see and you don't even know. So every time that this happens, you end up with at least some people who feel like they're walking out on their own into an uncertain future. And they find out there are other people walking to the same place. And that's important because often with courage, there's a deep loneliness. So if you're the woman who's working in the convenience store and you know that money's being embezzled from that convenience store, and your conscience is bothering you about that, the easy thing in order just to have peace is to look the other way and not to do anything about the embezzlement. If you actually say, hey, we're involved in a criminal conspiracy here, you're going to be very lonely, especially if all your friendships are in that convenience store where you work. Your entire identity is bound up in what you do at that convenience store. It's going to feel very, very lonely. But that's what God does in order to put together actual and genuine communities.
Which is, sometimes so very difficult to figure out, really, in some ways. I as you talk through this, I'm just trying to think how this works itself out, because part of what your book, the thesis behind the book is that we're not suffering from a lack of clarity. We're suffering from this lack of courage.
Yeah.
But I can hear, I just imagine people listening to our conversation going, but I don't know what to do in this particular situation. And then I don't think nobody on the face of it says, I want to be complicit or I want to be accommodating. But I also can hear the voice of one of my pastors, one of my mentors, who said, when it comes to some of this big stuff, he had this phrase. He said, you can't straighten teeth with a hammer. That you have to put braces on teeth and you have to tighten them up about every 60 to 90 days and move the teeth gradually, which I could hear somebody back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, Jim Crow era going, well, we can't go that fast. We can't go that far. We have to change this, but we have to change this gradually, incrementally. And the same thing with the woman at the convenience store in your illustration. Well, I'm going to keep working on that. I'm going to keep trying to find a way to put pressure on that, but I'm not going. I don't want to go too far because I'll lose my opportunity over time.
Yeah. Well, see, this is the thing. It's are there some things that have to be changed gradually and incrementally? Yes. But there also is the great danger of being able to justify our complicity in anything with an appeal to gradual, incremental means. So you think about it in terms of you just think about it in terms of a person's own discipleship. I might have one person, and I have in recent weeks. I've had one person who's come to me. He's beating himself up because he just can't believe that he's as sinful as he is, and he thinks God's mad at him. And what I'm having to do is to come in and say, remember the gospel, and all that's happening is that you are confessing before God what God has already told you, that you're a sinner. You're always going to be a sinner. Now, I wouldn't give that same counsel in the same way to somebody who came in, as has been the case before, who said, I'm having an affair. And I know that's not right, but I also know that sanctification is progressive. We're never going to be totally redeemed this side of heaven. And so, no, to that person, you need to come in and say, oh, wait. You're using gradual, incremental process of sanctification to justify your own sin. And that's somebody who needs to be hit from the other direction. So sometimes you've got people, there's a temptation to be impatient and to expect immediate change in some area. But often the temptation is very different, because you can always talk yourself into this. I see this with members of Congress, with pastors, with business leaders, with almost every reality of life that I deal with. You'll have people who will say, okay, I'm in a situation in which something is really morally wrong, but I know that if I bring it up, I'm just going to be exiled. I'm going to be kicked out. And whoever comes in after me is going to be somebody who won't be concerned about these things. It'll be somebody who's even worse. So what I need to do is I need to conserve my influence. And that means going along with things until there's a moment. Well, the problem with that is there never is a moment that comes at which a person can say, okay, now all the risk is gone. Now all the cost is gone. Now I can take all of that influence that I've conserved and use it. Instead, what happens is you start to pattern your own conscience, and you start to train your own conscience to go quiet. Because after time, you have to find a way to both think about your own place in whatever that system is, without thinking of yourself as a villain. And so what you typically do is just to rewrite the story in ways that can justify virtually anything. So again, it comes back to that same thing we were talking about before, in terms of knowing your own vulnerabilities. So look in your past and say, am I the kind of person whose vice is typically impatience? And I don't even give people the opportunity to change. And there are a lot of people like that. I mean, especially in a social media sort of environment, where we think that the way people change is you tell them they're wrong And then at the end of that, after 20 minutes, they say, "You're exactly right. I'm evil." That's not the way it works.
It doesn't go that way.
It doesn't go that way. Usually, instead, it works the way that Jesus told us that things work, both, and he uses this imagery, both with good and evil of yeast, works itself through. So if you think about the big changes that any of us have ever made, what happens is we usually kind of mull them
Hmm.
and we think about them. And sometimes we think about them for a long time until something happens, maybe some sort of crisis. And we kind of like the prodigal son, we come to ourselves
Right.
in that. That's so if you've got a temptation to not see that, then watch it and
Hmm.
correct for it. But then you also have a lot of people who have that other temptation of saying, I'm going to find a way to justify my situation and to justify whatever crowd I'm a part of. Watch that.
Right. And several other options more, some of which you've pointed out, right? Which is one of the options, which is to be cynical and withdrawn. If you have
Yeah.
a tendency toward that,
Yeah.
and just to say, well, I don't have any influence, and I'm going to try to pull away from all of this as much as I can, and just live a life of pessimism, cynicism, rather than one of hope and dynamics. Oh, that conversation makes me ask this question, which is, whether it was Elijah or others that we could talk about, when a person is actually being courageous, do you think that they know that they're being courageous?
No, I don't think so. I find that very rare that someone knows that. As a matter of fact, I think with almost anything going on in our lives, we don't really see it or notice it except in retrospect. And even then, I don't think that we see it very much. So you think about, for instance, often there will be moments in history that we'll talk about, and we have to stop and say, now, wait a minute. This story, I mean, as we're recording this, it's the anniversary of D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, D-Day is one thing for us because we know how World War II turns out. That was not the same reality that those men were facing as they stormed the beaches, because they didn't know how this was going to turn out. General Eisenhower had a letter written out, a statement for if it failed. So there's a great deal of ambiguity there. So sometimes there's what's called survivor bias. And a lot of times, even with our own lives, we have survivor bias that because we lived through something, we sort of forget how actually fraught that was.
Mm.
And but with anything, I think it's you're looking backward and you're saying, sometimes even I think there's a sense of amazement when we look back and say, how did I survive that?
Mm.
And sometimes you don't have an answer.
Right.
You don't know.
Yeah.
You just managed to survive it.
You're just kind of glad that you can actually have the thought that
You're right.
How did I survive that? And you come back to where we come back to and need to so often, which is just simply the goodness and grace of God is how we got through any of that. Right.
Yeah.
Russell, there seems to be a theme of courage running through the last number of years in your life. If we look at your writing, the work Onward was obviously along this same theme. This book, Courage to Stand, and a book that you're going to release later, about the time that this podcast is released, called Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. That sounds like it's on the same theme of courage in a particular way. Tell us about that book, Losing Our Religion.
That book is about, if I had to sum it up in one word, I would say it's less about courage than it is about cynicism. Because we're living in a very tumultuous moment in the American church, and especially in the American evangelical church, with political divisions and idolatries, and racial divisions and injustice, and sexual abuse and scandals that have been covered up. I mean, there's just so much that's being revealed right now. And I find that people are being tempted towards cynicism, but they're tempted towards cynicism in two different ways. So one way to be cynical is what we think of usually when we think of the word, which is to say, oh, religion's all nonsense, and because I've seen all of these things, that means that that must be true of Jesus. I'm walking away. That can be cynicism. But there's another kind of cynicism that says, well, this is just the way things are, so I'm going to adapt to it.
Hmm.
And that's a cynicism too. And so losing our religion is saying we actually don't have to go in either of those directions. What we can do is to remain faithful to the gospel, think about what it is that Jesus actually told us we would face, and there can be a renewal. But the way that renewal typically happens biblically is first a tearing down. So it seems, as Kierkegaard said, if you bring genuine Christianity, it's going to feel at first like taking Christianity away. And I think that's what's happening right now. And so we're headed into a future that I think of A.W. Tozer back in the middle of the 20th century said, we don't want revival of the church the way that it is, because that would be a zombie. You would just be continuing the death that is there. What we actually want is crucifixion of everything that needs to be crucified, and a renewal and a revival of what ought to remain. And I think that's what's happening right now. And that's why I wrote Losing Our Religion as somebody who a lot of times people will say, after the past several years dealing with what I would see as political captivity of the church, dealing with a resurgent racist backlash that's happening in many parts of North America right now, dealing with sexual abuse in the church. Why are you still a Christian, having seen some of the worst aspects of professing Christianity? And I'll usually say it's because I was already vaccinated for that, because I went through this time as a 15-year-old where I was despondent, because I was looking around and saying, maybe this is just Southern culture. And maybe this is just another kind of political marketing. And so I spent this time in this dark night of the soul to be able to differentiate between Jesus and the Bible Belt. So I was able already to have been through that in a manageable crisis, in a way that could prepare me for a bigger one. So what I'm usually finding myself saying to people, especially young people, because this is what's worrying me, is that, when I started in ministry, I would have younger people who would come and say, I'm thinking about walking away from the church. It almost always had to do with one of two things. It was either because the person was saying, I just can't accept the supernatural aspects of Christianity, some point or the other. I can't believe a virgin got pregnant. I can't believe that a dead person came back to life. I can't believe these things. Or they thought that the moral rules of the church were too strict on them, and they wanted to do something different. That's almost never what I'm encountering right now. Instead, I'm often encountering people who will say, I don't think the church itself believes what the church teaches. I don't think this is really about the gospel at all. And so for those people, or in many cases to say, I think the church is actively immoral. And in many cases it is. So for those people, what I want to say is not, don't be disillusioned. It's have the right kind of disillusionment. If you think about what the word really means, a loss of illusions. Let your illusions go, and instead find something that is permanent and real and that actually can stand. And I think we can do that. I think we're just at a moment where there are a lot of people who are where I was at 15, but in ways that I don't think always are going to go that way. And so I want to speak to them, and I also want to speak to the people around them to say we really have a responsibility to make sure the witness of the church is better than this.
Well, yeah, it's such a good word. And with just a few more minutes before we need to end, but just, it makes me come back to this thought that I've been having recurring, listening to you and your own podcast and writing and others in this space as well is, just we put it in different context. The way I frame it right now is, well, we've been talking about these culture wars for so long. If we as believers actually won the culture war, what would we actually win? I just don't even have any kind of an answer for that. But you and I have come, we have come of age, you might say, in a season where evangelical Christianity has been wed to politics from the 70s on, and our whole life, my whole life in ministry has been bound up in that. Probably a reaction in many ways, a fearful reaction to what was going on in the culture in the 50s and the 60s, that type of thing. Is there anything giving you hope at this point that maybe we've gotten as evangelical Christians finally to the place of being both exhausted and disillusioned with this unhealthy marriage that grew up over time, where where so many instances of the church of Christians trying to solve the problems that can only be solved by the gospel, by solving them through political means or other things. You talk about that in your book some. What's giving you hope on that front?
What's giving me hope is that when I'm going around talking to young evangelical Christians, I am not finding the kind of cynicism that I might expect to find. As a matter of fact, when I'm on a college campus, which is all the time, and I'm talking to Christian students, there are going to be really 3 questions that I'm going to be absolutely sure that I'm going to get. And they're questions that I never would have gotten before in that context in my ministry. One of them is going to be, how do I pray? The second is going to be, how do I get to know the Bible when my attention seems to be so attenuated? And the third is something along the lines of, how do I maintain a relationship with my family when maybe they've been drawn into some conspiracy theories or some sort of political division, and that's all they want to talk about? And what's life-giving about that is that I can't even think of a single time where what the Christian is saying is, give me the talking points to be able to win those arguments. It's almost always, I really want to have a relationship with my mom and dad, or with my Aunt Gladys, or whoever it is. Can you show me some way to connect with them without all of that? So these are the kids are all right. I mean, they have their own troubles, just like we all do, but the Spirit's really doing something there. And so I think that there's great reason for hope when you look at that, and then when you look at what God's doing around the world. We talked about Tim Keller. We first started. I had Tim come one time. I was teaching in the Institute of Politics at University of Chicago for a semester, and I had Tim come to the class with me one day. None of these were all completely secular students who had never met an evangelical Christian until me. And they didn't know who Tim Keller was at all. And I think a lot of them were thinking, why are we talking to some pastor from New York? Until about 30 seconds in when they started to realize,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
wait. But one of them said, because Tim made some reference to evangelical Christianity, and the student said, why do you all retain that word when it's become a synonym for a certain kind of political activism and all of these scandal cover-ups and everything else? And Tim said, because most of us are in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and the North Americans don't get to just choose what we're called.
Mm.
And I thought the most important thing in that sentence was the word us, the sense of we are part of a global body of Christ that the Spirit is doing some amazing things in. So if you sort of telescope out and you see the body of Christ around the world, and then you think about that body of Christ united to the body of Christ as it is in heaven, and you think about the sort of confidence that Jesus has about the advance of the church, which is honestly what I think we're missing the most. There's a lack of confidence that the gospel's really true and that the Spirit really works. And for some people, that turns into, well, then that means we're at a moment of catastrophe and we have to fight against whoever the enemies are, or we're going to be extinguished. And that means all rules are out, emergency measures going. For some people, it's a sense of kind of cowering down and having a sort of intellectual inferiority complex when it comes to Christianity. That's not what the Christian gospel is. There's a confidence that comes with it that Caesarea Philippi still stands.
Right.
And
Yep.
that means that we could be both calm. Jesus is never freaking out in the New Testament. We can be calm and we can actually move forward and bear witness. We can recover that.
Yeah, and just like I said, that confidence, I think you're right, that in so many ways, the American church has lost its sense of confidence.
Yeah.
Whereas, when we're in Israel, we take people up to Caesarea and say, Jesus chose to found the church here at what they understood to be the gates of hell. He didn't do it in Jerusalem. He didn't do it in Capernaum. He didn't do it in Nazareth. He could have done it anywhere, but he chose to do it right where they thought the very presence and entry to hell was. And he was like, we're going to prevail. We're going to go right up to the gate and start pushing because the gospel will ultimately be the victor. And if we can just get to the place where, in our families, our communities, we see ourselves more as missionaries rather than warriors trying to win this or that argument or some other kind of battle, I think we'll be serving the Lord a lot better in those ways. Dr. Moore, thank you for being a part of this conversation. The book is Courage to Stand. The coming book later this summer is Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. Dr. Moore, as I said, I'm a fan, even a bigger fan as of today. Thank you for who you are, for what you do. We will continue to follow all of your work, and our audience can do that by finding you at Christianity Today, your podcast, The Russell Moore Show, and I listen to it regularly. Thank you for that work and for your other work. And we want to thank our audience for being with us today. If you like what you heard today and it was helpful to you, please rate, review us, and pass this on to your friends and family. That will help them be a part of the conversation as well. Dr. Moore, blessings on you, your work, and on your family.
Well, you as well. Thank you for having me.